Howdy, folks. Welcome to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. I am the Redneck, and you bet I've gone green, and I'm trying to convince you to do it too. And a friendly reminder that when we say going green on this program, we mean it on multiple levels. The first and most important level is deep ecology, not merely environmentalism or conservationism, but a level of understanding about the interconnectedness of all of life, a recognition that it's not even just stewardship, but instead a interconnected balance, that we are all living beings connected, and anything that we do to that web of life, ultimately, y'all, we do it to ourselves. The second way that we mean green is Green Party. I am an unapologetic, proud Green Party member, and I'm trying to convince others of the need to create independent political activity. Now, we don't turn this program into a rah-rah Green Party. I'm more than happy to talk about the strengths and virtues as well as the weaknesses and vices of the Green Party. But one thing I know for sure, and that is throughout all of history, that the only time there have been systemic transformational changes made in this country or anywhere in the world ultimately is because ordinary people rolled up their sleeves, worked together to create that world from the bottom up. And it is in that spirit that I am very happy to welcome Suren Moodliar to Redneck Gone Green. Suren is a personal friend of mine, so I want to own that right up front. I also think of Suren as one of the real brilliant global strategists. Suren has basically got a lifetime as an author, an activist, a strategist, and he is going to be talking about some of the emerging global political formations, the global tapestry of alternatives, as well as Progressive International. So with that, let's welcome Suren Moodliar to Redneck Gone Green. Howdy, Suren.
Hey, thank you, David. I'm really glad to finally join you on this particular forum. So thank you for having me. Yep, I am definitely one of those people who's gone green. So let's go.
Let's do it. And you know, Suren, before we get underway, I have the great privilege of knowing you on a personal basis. And I'm really eager for the political conversation that we're going to have, because we have them all the time when we get together. Only difference is this time we've got an audience. But I want to take a moment for you to share a little bit about the unique perspective of you as a human. So Suren, who are you and why do you do what you do?
Okay, yeah. Thanks for asking me this, David. And yeah, there is this personal connection, which for me is really important. Let me say why that's important before I say a little bit about myself. You know, it used to be a strong truism on the left that there are no permanent friends, they're just permanent issues. For me, that's just simply wrong. There are friends, there are values, and these are the things that make the basis, create the groundwork for us to organize on and to expand those friendships into things that have organizational and long-term movement consequences. So I'm glad that we're able to interleave these different dimensions to it. If I were to put a thumbnail sketch together for who I am in order that people may evaluate my positionality, as it were, I'll just say a few things. I grew up in South Africa of the 1960s and 70s. In South Africa, it's called the Silent 60s. In the 1970s, when I was a teenager, it's the beginning of mass movements. And then by the 1980s, the country erupts into a revolutionary fervor. And those events have shaped my consciousness. However, there is something that makes me a little less common than other revolutionaries or other radical thinkers, which is that I came to the United States. And that shaped my involvement in the South African struggle too, as a member of the African National Congress, but participated in the divestment movement of the 1980s in the United States. However, staying in the United States, getting involved in the union movement, I was involved in the UAW struggle to organized the University of California system, resulting ultimately after a nearly 10-year struggle in, upwards of 15,000 new workers being organized into a local across the University of California, and laying the basis for other academic employee struggles as well. So I have those different kinds of experiences blended together. And I know that we run in parallel to a certain degree here too, don't we, David?
Well, we do, Suren. And what's really worth pointing out, y'all, is Suren and I found out later, right? We're more or less of the same age, right? And I also came of consciousness during the anti-apartheid work. Of course, I grew up in rural Texas, and I'll tell. Indulge me, Suren, because I love to tell the story. I worked in construction for a couple of years right out of high school, right? And I still remember going to the University of Houston. I went to junior college for a year or two. Then I finally got to the University of Houston. I was like long-haired kid riding a Harley Davidson motorcycle. And I still remember to this day seeing a big sign that said, "End apartheid now." And I was like, "Oh, I know what apartheid is. That's terrible. I'd like to help end it." But what's really important is behind that or underneath that sign, that banner, there was a table, and behind that table there was a human being, an activist. Suren, I had never actually seen with my own eyes an activist. I'm probably 20, 21 years old. I had literally never seen anybody do that in the real world. And I hustled right over there, and I'll never forget. I ended up in what I now understand to be a political argument with the fella. We weren't yelling at each other, but we were really grappling because that dude was trying to tell me something about how I was inadvertently supporting apartheid because I was a student at the University of Houston, and there was something called a board of regents, and they were investing in South African corporations, and it was a little bit confusing. But what pissed me off was that joker said the U.S. government supported apartheid. And I remember saying, man, this is America. Like, where did you go to school? We're the good guys. Like, we're for liberty, justice, and equality. Suren, the fella did not fuss at me. He didn't denigrate and insult me. I remember he said, I've got all this material here, but I don't reckon any of this is actually going to convince you. But I'll make you a deal. If you go to the MD Anderson Library, it's literally just 100 yards away, and read the U.S. News and World Report or Time Magazine or any of the major things, because apartheid at that time, it was everywhere, right? He said, you read that, just read one cover article on apartheid, and I'll read anything you want me to read. Then let's have another conversation, just so we start at the same place. And of course, I tell that story on myself because that fellow was right. I was wrong. But what he did was took me where I was, but he didn't leave me there. He invited me into real political dialogue and discourse. By the end of that semester, Suren, I was on the other end of that table, passing out literature, got really active. And I'll end with this. Dude, that's how I like to say I got my start in politics, y'all. We weren't in an election at all, but make no mistake about it, that was political organizing. And here's one thing I learned, Suren. When we followed the rules and elected a spokesperson and went and petitioned and did all the things we're allowed to do, the administration totally ignored us. But when we disrupted meetings, when we took over the Board of Regents office, when we began to exercise genuine disruptive power, all of a sudden we were able to make real change. And I reckon, Suren, that's something that you experienced too.
Very much so, David. Although the roads were different, my on-ramps were a little bit different than your on-ramps, right? But inspired by your account, let me provide a little bit of an account of the South African crucible for my politics, right? I would say the following. In the 1970s, we felt very alone. It was an era of heroic struggle in that there were well-known people who were prominent symbols of resistance to the apartheid system, and they were often politically banned because their organizations were banned or because they individually were banned. And this fostered several different kinds of mindsets. on the one hand, my whole family, parents down to the kids, we were always afraid of being arrested by the government and thrown into jail without trial. This had another political consequence. There was a deep sense that we needed to count on each other as families, and it strengthened our families, but it also strengthened our relationships with other people whom we could trust as well. One of the things we noticed about this need to trust each other was that we were depending on the character of people as much as we were depending on their commitments um, and their political ideology, but it was far more so than their political ideology. As a result, we learned to work across ideological lines within the same struggle. So let me name some names from that period to indicate how this plays out, right? In the 1970s, Black consciousness was a dominant formation within South Africa, right? And it emphasized Black self-reliance. It emphasized unity of all oppressed people. There's some debate as to whether that could have included white working class people, but it certainly included people of color, etc., right? And in addition to unity of all oppressed and self-reliance, there was also a strong ethos of non-collaboration with the government. The Black consciousness movement took this sort of picked up this strand from what was called the unity movement of the 1940s and 50s in South Africa. But then there was something else. By the 1980s, we enter this period of mass struggle. Heroic individuals are still important, but now it's about the capacity to move large numbers of people, thousands, tens of thousands, into the hundreds of thousands, and to organize structures like trade unions and consolidate their organization. And I think this is what the African National Congress at its best in South Africa represented, a coming together of many strands of the movement, but with a focus on deeper and more disciplined organization. All of these things really shaped me personally. My first political experiences, to the extent that could look back on them as political, was when my father sent me out to deliver pamphlets. I was six or seven at the time, to people in our community. And some people were very frightened to receive those pamphlets, and other people wanted to engage in a dialogue and wanted me to go home and tell my father to come and see them, and that kind of thing. So it was that face-to-face politics that also was something important to me, and it's something that has never left me. I go canvassing today with my daughter and with her friends and with my own friends. And so all of these elements, the fact that the struggle isn't something abstract, but requiring of face-to-face relationships. It also taught me that ideas and solidarity are important, but these require organizational mechanisms to make them practical and possible, and for them to have efficacy. So I'll stop
Suren, I
there.
really appreciate what I appreciate about. You're right. Our on ramp was very similar, but you were the South African version of what we in the U.S. call a red diaper baby, right? Like you were really born into the struggle. But one thing I really want to underscore that I pick up out of that was being really grounded in a truly non-dogmatic, non-sectarian approach to revolution. Like, in other words, like we have to restructure this whole fucking thing and just like embrace that you're not trying to reform apartheid, right? Like, so I often say that people in the global South are actually part of the reason that I think that they're so more politically developed than we are is you don't really have to convince people that the imperialism that they experience on a lived basis day to day is somehow good, right? Like they know it sucks, right? And you growing up in a system that is so explicitly oppressive and so obviously immoral. It makes it easier really to say we shouldn't reform this, we should end it, right? So I really appreciated that, like the ability to ground in real lived experience and do it as a revolutionary without becoming dogmatic.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I would say, me being a South African analog to a red diaper baby is, I think, very much true. Although my parents were associated with the with different political traditions than, say, the CPUSA in the United States, right?
Right.
One thing I would also want to add, though, is that consciousness shifted in South Africa over time, to a point where by the end of the 1980s, there was a genuine revolutionary consciousness, but that consciousness wasn't a natural evolution of time over time. It took armed propaganda in the South African case to educate the Black majority that the ruling government, the government of the day, was not something that was undefeatable. It could be
And
defeated.
what I really appreciate that about that too was, and I've experienced it multiple times. So often, the challenge is not to convince people that change is needed, but that we have the capacity to change, and that we have the agency to do it, and that we can actually win a new world.
Yeah, for sure. Although today, when we look back on from South Africa's present, we have to ask, how is it that all that great sacrifice, that intense struggle, to the point where, two American Marxist writers looking at South Africa in the 1980s, Paul Sweezy and and Harry Magdoff, looking at South Africa, they said that nowhere else in the world is there a classical Marxist revolutionary scenario such as in South Africa. And yet today, when we look back, we recognize that a U-turn was pulled somewhere along the way. And
Well,
so we have to think about that.
we do have to
Yeah,
think about that, and let's get into it. And before we jump, though, deeper, I do want to continue with your work as a union organizer with the UAW, specifically
yeah,
with adjunct professors and such,
yeah,
learning about the interconnectedness. Because for me, right out of the anti-apartheid movement, it just naturally segued into supporting Jesse Jackson for president in '84 as a student
yeah,
organizer, in '88, where I actually became a delegate to the Democratic
yeah,
convention in the state of Texas. And, I learned a lot, Suren, working on the Jesse Jackson for president campaign. I learned as a white person how to genuinely put myself under the leadership of people of color, specifically Black leaders. I
yes,
learned how to bring environmentalists and union representatives into dialogue. I learned how to incorporate the women's struggle. I learned about Palestine for the first time. I learned a lot. I learned the importance of fundraising. I'll never forget Reverend Jackson brought some of the key people together and said, looky here. He didn't say looky here. I think that was me. But what he did say was, he never spoke in a way that wasn't poetic and melodic, right? But what he did say was, never insult someone by not giving them the opportunity to financially contribute to what they obviously believe in. We need the money. And if you just get them to give $10, you have gotten them to invest in this movement. So fundraising is critical to actually building the movement. And on that tip, I want to say, folks, please join Redneck Gone Green. We have a weekly Substack where writing goes out every week. We also come to you. Maybe you're watching us live on YouTube or Facebook or Rumble. Maybe you're listening to us afterwards on our podcast, where you can get it on all the places. So we always make our content available for free. And for people who subscribe as low as $5 a month, Jack and I are going to start doing a weekly reach out to folks in the green room after the program. We won't do it this program, but starting next week, if you give as little as $5 a month, we're going to be inviting you into a post-interview green room conversation. But again, we'll always make this show available for free because we think that what we're doing here is critically important for movement building. So, Suren, I want to shift then into the U.S. work, because I first got to know you as a human being. I still remember in 2004 at the Boston Social Forum. Can you explain to our viewers the relationship? Because we're going to talk globally, talk about the World Social Forum, what it is, and why the Boston Social Forum is so important.
Well, there are a lot of starting points with with activities of such a large scale as the World Social Forum, right? And it began in the late 1990s when people were responding to the reemergence of global social movements that was first identified in 1992 with the Rio Counter Summit, right? And by 2001, the different social movements had accumulated enough experience and political power to recognize that we needed a counterpole to the World Economic Forum, which was being convened in Davos, Switzerland, by the global financial elites. And so
Before
they
you go
called.
forward, I
Yeah.
do want to just let folks know, in case they weren't familiar with it, Rio in 1992 is really credited with one of the first times that at least the global left or the global movement came together to say very explicitly the only way to have genuine economic progress is to tie it inextricably to environmental protection and ecology. It was an effort to bring organized labor and economic justice and climate justice and environmental protection together in a real coherent way.
Absolutely, David. And one other thing to add to the account you just provided is that by the early 2000s, the reigning ideology was that of neoliberalism, an argument that there's no alternative to that form of capitalism in which at least three things were happening: deregulation, financialization, and privatization. And so the World Social Forum was a bold assertion held together predominantly by Brazilian trade unionists and intellectuals on the one hand, and French left-wing thinkers on the other hand. And so it was a bold declaration that there are, in fact, alternatives. So how did that manifest itself in our little humble Boston Social Forum back in 2004?
And before
Around
you
about,
get into Boston, I can't let it go by. Anytime, you're right that the 1990s and that there is no alternative. Well, I still remember hearing it, and it became such a refrain. And there's a special place in hell for Margaret Thatcher as well as Bill Clinton. But the phrase "there is no alternative," Tina, there is no alternative. To which my retort is, "Ta ta." There are thousands of alternatives. And so it was another example of the need to break out of the thinking that the common sense was, well, capitalism is inevitable. We just have to reform it. And that deregulation, like the notion of neoliberalism was as like the best way to, quote, tame capitalism. And I think it's bullshit, Suren.
Yeah, completely agree. I also think that we mustn't forget that neoliberalism wasn't something that sort of sprang about naturally, right? It was something that came about because trade unions were mercilessly brutalized. People lost not merely jobs, but their entire livelihoods. Their communities were torn asunder, and people spread over the country. I'm sure you've seen that in the United States in that period, right?
And by the way, let's just remember, let's see, neoliberalism, 1992, 1996. Who was president that shoved NAFTA? Remember, Ronald Reagan had fought vigorously for NAFTA, was never able to get it through because organized labor fought like dogs or just like mad and prevented it from happening. But Bill Clinton, the Democrat, was able to shove it down our throats. So again, I'm not going to turn this into Democrats suck, although I'm going to tell you this. The leadership of the Democratic Party absolutely sucks because they are part and parcel of this neoliberal consensus.
Yeah. Let me plant a subversive thought, right? back in the 1990s, as NAFTA was being unrolled, right? Remember, it came from the Mexican national security state linking up with the U.S. national security state, forgotten the name, Poindexter or someone, and then it was presented to the Department of State and other units of government within the United States, right? And it was rolled out. I remember attending a talk by someone from the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, Linda Wong, and she said to us in the meeting, I don't think we're going to defeat NAFTA. We need to be thinking now about what comes after. And I was so angry at hearing that. I thought this is defeatist and all, but I always think back to that lonely voice within our movement who demanded that we think about the long term. And I think that had we had the kind of autonomous or relatively autonomous political organizations to have those conversations, a lot of the things that we've seen come to pass, including the failure to take action on climate change. A lot of those things may have been avoided had we had the capacity to answer Linda Wong's question back then. So just want to leave that subversive thought alone, right? But
No,
it
but
always,
let's plan it firmly as we get back to the arc, right? The World Social Forum, because I really appreciate your point about it coming out of militant trade unionists in Brazil, as well as the very explicitly left public intellectuals. I completely agree with that. I would also say, my friend, I think that you should add a third point, and that is the really for Movimiento Sin Tierras, the landless peasants movement, and the fact that at the electoral level in Porto Alegre, the Workers' Party took control of the municipal government and the state government. They didn't win the national office, but they literally controlled the municipal government of Porto Alegre and the state that it was in.
yeah.
And that allowed them to literally say, we control these public buildings. Let's convene a World Social Forum.
Yeah, absolutely. That dimension, which is essentially a political dimension, which a lot of people leave out of any kind of an account of the World Social Forum process. But that political dimension allowed them to answer the organizational and infrastructural questions around such a convening, right? But I think there was a lot of intellectual dishonesty about it. Some people presented the World Social Forum as this spontaneous gathering that was just expressive of forces that are bubbling up from below. And yet, from the account that you've just provided, by adding this third dimension of organized forces like the MST and the fact of the ascendance of the Workers' Party, we understand then that there's an organizational component to all of this work that is ignored at our peril. To give you an example, by 2003, the World Social Forum was held in Porto Alegre again for its third edition. And there were about 100,000 people, mostly from Brazil, about 50 to 80,000 of whom would have come from other parts of Brazil. And then about 20,000 people from abroad came to the World Social Forum there. But it was a logistical nightmare. And the reason it was a logistical nightmare is that the Workers' Party had lost control of the province of Rio Grande do Sul while holding control of the city government. And as a consequence, things like timetables for where people would meet, where and when, were completely up in the air and completely separate from anything that was actually printed. And again, this is, I want to emphasize this organizational dimension. Might say that I'm a budding bureaucrat at 60 years old, but I think we have to come to terms with this organizational dimension.
Listen, I'm glad you did, because as you know, like, we're basically the same age, sir, and I'm 61 now, right? And one of the things that is very clear is that there is that disruptive power is absolutely necessary, but so is institutional power. And it doesn't mean selling out. It means having institutions that are capable of doing things. So, I really appreciate this World Social Forum context, And now I'm going to push you to say, because you had, and I know you're very modest, you always are, Suren, but you had a really critical role to play in bringing the social forum process to the United States for the very first time in 2004.
Yeah. So back in November of 2002, we found out that the Democratic National Convention would be held in Boston in 2004, and we looked around and thought about, well, what are the productive models for engaging with people who are coming to the city, even if we disagree with them, right? Most of us were about the people involved in the organizing, particularly a guy named Jason Pramus, whom you know, David. Were about independent politics, building a politics separate from the dominant two parties, while acknowledging that most of the trade unions we worked with actually worked with one of the two parties, and did so at a very close level of tactical integration. And we thought that the social forum model would be interesting. And I think we made some mistakes there, but one of the reasons why we thought the social forum model would be interesting is that it makes room for people to engage with one another outside of your political affiliation. It places an emphasis on ideas, and in addition to that, it creates a space for people to develop programs, but not to assert that program or foist it onto all other people taking part in the program. So we saw it as a generative space, and so we held it in July, right before and into the first day of the Democratic National Convention. More than 5,000 paid attendees took part in it. We had 200 events, and several hundred organizations also participated. Whether that large number of organizations is a sign of strength or weakness, I think we can now say, it was really a reflection of our weakness, but it was also a reflection of our capacity to reach out beyond our immediate political circles and reach out in an ecumenical way and a kind of secular way to other forces on the left. And that's where we met you for the first time.
Yeah, that's where you and I met. And of course, I knew Jason because Jason was a real leader in the Green Party. I met Jason through the Green Party. And I do remember, I'll just be candid, Suren, I came into the Boston Social Forum kind of in awe. I had never been in a place where 5,000 social change agents were gathering in this ecumenical space where literally you had, Green Party people, you had reformers, you had revolutionaries, it was like a carnival of progressive ideas. So, to me, I appreciate your willingness to really offer constructive critique and self-critique, etc. But I got to tell you, for somebody like me, where I was in my journey, I thought it was nothing except for spectacular because I had been accustomed to protests. I had been accustomed to convening in oppositional ways, but to convene in a propositional way at the same time with protest and proposition, right? Because at least for me, Suren, up until that point, it had been either you're trying to propose using electoral processes or you're trying to protest using disruptive power, but trying to put them together. So I've got nothing but praise and appreciation for you and Jason and all the other hundreds of folks who convened a space to let those kind of dialogues happen.
Yeah. I'll just mention two names because I feel obliged to do it. One is no longer with us, Charles Turner. Right? He was a member of the Green Rainbow Party, a city councillor in Boston, but somebody who was genuinely a councillor from the streets, right? In that he built his movement up, working with young people, men who had been responsible for violent acts against partners, intimate partner violence. He worked with them, recognizing that people aren't disposable people. And he convened at the Boston Social Forum, in addition to calling everyone together at our opening sort of plenary session, he also convened something called the Movement Building Track, which involved several hundred people who wanted to focus on electoral politics, but in a way that conformed to the needs of the grassroots. And so Chuck Turner, for me, is an exemplary figure of that period, right? And another friend of mine, a mutual friend, is Jonathan Levitt, who went on to organize a number of campaigns long before marijuana was legalized. He ran those campaigns in Maine. And so, both Chuck Turner and Jonathan Levitt and a number of the other people who were involved all symbolize for me people who were about building independent institutions. They were about collaborating with whom they needed to collaborate with, and to propose. And they were people with something to propose. And so that was the ethos, I think, of the Boston Social Forum at its best. Yeah.
Thank you for that, and thanks for bringing up. Of course, Chuck Turner, comes out was one of the collaborators with Mel King of the Rainbow Party. And again, so there's a rich history, but I want to take this moment to say thank you for listening and or watching Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. I am the redneck. I've gone green, trying to convince you to do it too. Today, we're talking with Suren Moodliar. Suren is the founder of Encuentro Cinco. He's also the managing editor of Socialism and Democracy, and he is an author. He is a strategist. He's a get shit done organizer. Suren, I want to take the Boston Social Forum in 2004 because the next time that space convened was in Atlanta at the U.S. Social Forum. So talk about that, what was learned, what was applied, and just talk us through that.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the international level before we revert to the U.S. Social Forum of 2007. In 2003, the big thing that happened, of course, was the invasion of Iraq. And the World Social Forum became a platform for organizing the global protest movement against this war in Iraq. The social forces that came together to produce the biggest actions were those peace movement people in Europe, right? Whether it was Stop the Wars Coalition, Stop the War Coalition, in the UK, or the remnants of the Italian left that organized, 3 million people in Rome, and similarly large demonstrations in France from the traditional French left. So the World Social Forum, seemed to both be a burgeoning movement in that period in response to the war, and it also became a place where not only was the struggle against global neoliberalism being prosecuted, but it was also a place where the struggle against global militarism, as indicated by the neocons in the Bush White House. So these forces were together. What was different about the US Social Forum in 2007 is that the peace movement energies had somewhat waned by the time of 2007 and the US Social Forum. And so, unlike at the Boston Social Forum, the peace movement wasn't as well or as strongly represented in Atlanta in 2007. Nonetheless, there was a vibrant national group of organizations that came together representing the global grassroots movement, global grassroots. And they represented community-based organizations with a base-building agenda. And they were able to pull off a very sophisticated event, in contrast to the Boston Social Forum, which was held outside of the city center at a university. This happened right in downtown and spread out across to satellite sites, but right at the major hotels in downtown. It also indicated a certain increase in economic and fundraising capacity, where you had large foundations putting money into the social forum. And as a consequence, we could have this downtown kind of presence. The question that was raised, I think, subsequently then is, how sustainable was that, right? To what extent can we have forces that are able to pull this off with the same kind of panache and esprit de corps as the organizing team of the 2007 Social Forum, but without that level of funding? And I think that's a big question for the left. But David, you were there too.
No, I
And
was
so,
like, I think myself and Ben Mansky of the Liberty Tree Foundation literally put together the democracy track and built a democracy tent as part of that. When I lift up my mentor and comrade Jerome Scott, who brought me in, I ended up being on the National Planning Committee of the U.S. Social Forum, both in Atlanta in 2007, then in Detroit in 2010, I think it was.
yeah,
So I learned a lot. And one of the things, and it's true, we were able to put together a lot of stuff because we had financial resources. What I also recognized was the power of movement building. Like, you learn to work together by working together, right? And it's not just that you're convening an event, it's that you're doing intentional movement building. And Chuck Turner and Mel King were really good about that. Jerome Scott was really good about that. There's a whole series of folks who I thought were really instrumental in helping me think through that. And I do want to actually make sure that we get to the two new global formations, because I think the World Social Forum, frankly, it was very influential, but it feels to me like it's kind of waned, maybe lost some of its political edge. But as I look out on the global horizon, as the global ecological collapse is accelerating, as fascism is rising, Global Tapestry of Alternatives and Progressive International seem like the two global political formations that's giving me the most hope.
yeah. Yeah, I certainly agree with you. The both of those formations do different kinds of things, but they both provide me with a sense of hope. Let's start with the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. The Global Tapestry of Alternatives is about weaving these alternatives together so that they can achieve scale as well as spread out more. And so it convenes regularly with assemblies over the course of a year. Many U.S. organizations like May 1st, Movement Technology, are part of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. So we do find that this is an intellectual space. It adopts the form of a network of networks, which is a bit different than movements of movements, right? And so I think that one of the questions that the Global Tapestry of Alternatives helps answer is one about how we can work together at a sustainable level without the support of huge Ford Foundation like nonprofits, right? And that's by relying on smaller organizations around the world without a central structure and convening sort of people scale meetings, unlike the 100,000, 200,000 people who attended the earlier World Social Fora, right? And so it is an intellectual space. It exists, it's structured, there's a facilitation team. And this is something that if you simply go to the website, globaltapestryofalternatives.org, you can figure out how to plug into things at different levels. Important thing for me too, it is multi-scalar, right? It starts out at the local levels, but works its way all the way up to the international level. I do believe there are challenges with this model that might be challenges that are necessary ones that we can't dispense with, and maybe it needs to be supplemented by other kinds of formations. One of the other kinds of formations are is Progressive International.
So
But
before
before
you
we go
before you
on
get
to
into
them,
Progressive International, Suren, I do want to lift up Michael Nugent, who is a frequent participant here on Redneck Gone Green. I think has a very powerful question that I think talks about some of the challenges associated. Michael asks, what is the relationship between these kinds of ecumenical or diverse movements and the development of cadre-based groups with an explicit aim of overthrowing capitalism? So Michael is actually talking about a sort of political strategic question or challenge, as you were still talking about the organizational challenge. Because this is the point, Michael. I think that we have to grapple with both the form as well as the content. And Suren, I'm going to invite you to react to Michael's, what I think is a very astute question and a very provocative one. What is the relationship between broad-based mass movement work and more explicit cadre based work that has the clarity of overthrowing capitalism?
You know, one of the most, say, amusing, possibly pathetic sights I've seen is when small Marxist-Leninist groups come to the World Social Forum and they see suddenly a proliferation of different kinds of groups articulating strong positions on a whole range of issues not explicitly considered by this or that sect. And as a consequence, these groups find absolutely no value in the World Social Forum. By contrast, I think an equally pathetic and unfortunately definitely not amusing sight is the sight of people articulating the need for very horizontal structures without any kind of capacity for prioritizing issues, for doing political education, and the formation of cadre. And so I think we need to figure out how to navigate these systems. I will say the following, right? That a lot of the people who lead these organizations are, in fact, very disciplined cadre with an outlook. And but what seems to be missing is a way to put them into dialogue with one another so that our ideas can be tested against one another and with one another so that we can achieve higher levels of synthesis. And so I do see the need for organizational formations like the type that Michael Nugent is talking about. I'm not sure that that it is in contradiction with these networks of network structures, and that we need to find ways to navigate these networks of networks in order to build these structures that can be collective points for interpreting the world and how we can act in the world. So
Yes,
I'm afraid I'm sort of ducking out of Michael's question. I remember Michael Nugent from Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice in Los Angeles. Is this the same Michael Nugent?
Well, let's find out. I met Michael through Kali Akuno, and
Okay.
I now you're making me want to bring Mike Crenshaw from the Minneapolis Baldies and Anti-Racist Action. So again, sir, and we've got circles within circles. So Michael, if you are the same Michael that Suren knows, please drop that in the chat. I also want to take this opportunity to really underscore and take it head on, because I do think that what cadre-based organizations are actually quite good at is developing consciousness and having clarity on capitalism and white supremacy and the need to actually restructure, right? So the role I think that a cadre type formations need, and I agree with Michael, there's not enough of them, but what the level of clear, cogent, disciplined political education. And I agree with you, Suren, that I don't think it's in contradiction to say we need mass movements that are actually capable of engaging ordinary people. I often say, like, I go into pool halls and bowling alleys, and I can have these kind of conversations, but I can't have strategic conversations that I can within cadre groups, right? So this is the thing. It's not that one is better than the other. It's that they're different and they have to relate together appropriately. That's how I would take that on. Again, not trying to avoid the question, but actually address it head on and say it's not either or, it needs to be both and.
Yeah. You know, David, in the last few years, I've noticed a movement. There were people who, around the time of the Seattle uprising, who became advocates, very firm advocates of horizontalism. They rejected representation of any form. By 2 decades later, what we're looking at are people who now recognize the need for a certain amount of representation, and they recognize the need for organizations that have a certain amount of command and control, which is sort of fundamental to any kind of organization.
Which does almost segue us right into progressive international, doesn't it?
Yep, very much so. So Progressive International calls Global Days of Action. It was founded in 2020, right? So during the pandemic lockdowns, right? And people like Bernie Sanders were there at the founding, but so too was, most importantly, I'd say, Yanis Varoufakis, who
Tell
came
us who
out
Giannis
of.
is for readers or listeners, viewers who may not be familiar with Giannis.
Okay, so he was a member of Syriza, the party that came to power in Greece in 2014 and was essentially booted out of power by being forced by the European Union to turn its back on its own electoral program and carry out austerity against its explicit mandate from the Greek people. Varoufakis resigned in protest rather than carry out the austerity, and he went on to found Progressive International. He's an important global thinker, but more importantly, sees himself as a kind of catalyst, bringing together people. So people like Kalia Kuno and Noam Chomsky and Naomi Klein were all part of the first round of Progressive International council members, right? And so they've established this organization around several different principles, including the fact that they're democratic, they stand for decolonization, they talk about inequality on a global scale, they're egalitarian, stand for liberty, and I can go down the list. And they're also explicitly post-capitalist. A number of US organizations have also affiliated with Progressive International, including, as well known an organization as Code Pink. I think the questions we need to ask of ourselves now is, how do we want to affiliate with Progressive International and turn the resources it has globally to the United States and deploy them here? Right? There's always been this push and pull on the US left. We're inspired by things happening abroad. We've learned, I think, in recent years to become more inspired by our histories, our diverse histories, starting with Indigenous people in this country. But the question is, how do we put all these pieces together? And I think that's still an unanswered question, David.
It is an unanswered question, but let's actually not only pose it, but actually do our best, you and me, like Cobb and Moodliar, to answer it. And in that spirit, what I would say is one of the things that I find both provocative, inspiring, and maddening is, how do we engage in electoral politics without becoming electoral fetishists? How can we actually engage in elections in a way that does not simply become yet one more Democratic Party voter ID or GOTV kind of effort? That, to me, is one of the challenges, and I do see glimpses of what that might actually look like.
Yeah. Okay, so I will just try to tell you what my answers have been, right? I mean, I believe we have to walk on 2 feet. We can't become electoral fetishists, right? We have to be doing base building work in order that we may advance on different fronts and that there's always a place to retreat to. I think also that if we are to find a referenda as an instrument, then I think we should definitely make use of it, because it allows us to reach out beyond parties, and it also allows us to gain electoral experience in doing that kind of work. So, I'll just stop at that, David, with a view to engaging with you further.
Yeah, so thank you for that, because I'm so glad you did, because you took it to the next level, right? How do we engage in electoral politics without becoming a voter ID or GOTV turnout led from behind or explicitly from the Democratic Party? I would argue 2 very concrete ways. Number 1, ballot initiatives. And those ballot initiatives can be either at the state level or at the local or county level. And I'll just give you an example. Here in little old Humboldt County, we were the first community to put on the ballot, to my knowledge, a campaign that literally stripped corporations of the ability to claim constitutional right to give money in elections. And we ran that as a ballot initiative. And we won in very red, so-called red or conservative areas, as well as the liberal areas, proving that you could actually bring together principled conservatives, that is culturally conservative people, and principled progressives or leftists, and find common ground around corporate power. But wait, there's more. Here in this community, Humboldt County again, we were able to pass the strongest immigrant rights ordinance of anything in the country, far surpassing what elected officials were willing to do. And in California, I'll just point out that the last time a statewide ballot initiative was used with all volunteer effort was back in the 1970s, and it resulted in the creation of the California Coastal Commission, which is still to this day the single strongest state regulatory framework to protect beaches and oceanfront from environmental degradation. Ballot initiatives work, and it takes a lot of work, but it's actually a way to legislate directly and engage people in a way that goes beyond just turning a lever for or against an individual candidate, and forces people to experience and experiment with what democratic organization, democratic participation actually looks like.
Yeah, I would say that where I'm located right now, which is central New York, we're not as politically mature as you all are in Humboldt, but inspired by your work. So we're still working with the various base building entities that I think would allow us to carry out those kinds of ballot initiatives down the line. We're setting up a land trust called Syracuse Action for Land and Transformation. We have done work at the city council level. For example, the Democratic Socialists and a number of community organizations came together to do the following: to create, to push for a ceasefire resolution around Gaza. Going into the actual voting in the city council, we thought we had 5 out of the 9 votes we needed, we had 5 votes, which gave us a majority. We ended up losing that 9-1. And so there's been a lot of backwards and forwards. Maybe this international relations issue wasn't the best to lead with. But one of the things that the city councillors who flipped and voted for the Zionists did was that they cited a number of local cases, a shooting in the community, etc., right? Ironically, that was the same city councillor who opposed us when we were doing things like good cause eviction to prevent the eviction of people simply because the landlord wants to raise rents in an exorbitant way, or wants to avoid getting inspected for code violations, and those kinds of things. So we are contemplating the use of these kinds of local ballot initiatives. New York doesn't have a statewide ballot initiative process, but local governments do allow it. So it's something that we want to explore, and we hope that maybe a little while down the line, David, we can report on some local successes here.
I would love that. And we're coming to the end of our program, but I do, if you can give us another 10 minutes or so, Suren, I'd love to actually talk about another tactic that I think is an example of how to engage elections from an authentic revolutionary approach. And that is, I'll confess, I am now embracing this idea of deep canvassing. I'm wondering if you've heard of that term. All right. So I'm going to ask you to explain, like, what is orthodox canvassing and what makes deep canvassing unique?
Yeah. So let me tell you about our practice here, right? We began canvassing at the heart of the pandemic, when there was an eviction moratorium and people were still being evicted from their houses. So we began to go house to house to people, whether they owned their homes or they rented their homes, to let them know of their rights, to prevent them from being evicted. Something that was important, right? This was completely separate from any kind of political work or larger political objective. Our goal was to be with the people. We then tracked the homes that we went canvassing to, and we began to develop relationships with people in the community. I wouldn't say it was perfect, right? But one of the things we did was we were able to ask people which of their neighbors we needed to talk with. And the more the neighbors became involved with each other and us in talking about the problem, the more we were developing a regular presence within the community, to the point where whenever we went canvassing, the children in the neighborhood recognized us and would come and tell us who to go and speak with. So I think that idea of being a regular presence in the community is one of the prerequisites to deep canvassing. It's the building of relationships in a way that doesn't correspond to electoral cycles, but correspond to the cycles of need and the changing political consciousness within the community. We were able to do the same kind of canvassing in the same community on the question of lead poisoning. And so now we're able to go back, and we're hoping to build on that to develop not only deeper relationships within community, but to, I hate to use this word, but harvest those relationships into developing committees within the community to figure out what needs to be shared with the community, and how to create structures where there can actually be assemblies in which we talk with each other about what needs to happen. So I don't know, David.
This conversation, Suren, because what it's actually pointing out is the dialectic, the understanding that what we do is we have a process by which we have an idea, we put it forward, we put it into practice, then we reflect, we learn, we synthesize, we adapt. So, this notion of either you like, I think it's a mistake if we don't completely understand that we've got to make people's lives better. Objective material conditions need to improve because folks engage with us. But we have to always be vigilant not to fall into mere reformism, right? Because if you really want to make people's lives better right away, you're almost always talking about some type of either reform or something within the system. It's not, by definition, it's not systemic and structural, right? But there is a difference between a non-reformist reform and just a normal reform. And I want to be clear, I don't think it's just necessarily, public banking is a non-reformist reform because it's so powerful, although I do think public banking is powerful. I would argue something different. I would say, don't focus on the action, focus on the strategic orientation that surrounds the action. For example, feeding hungry children in the morning before school. Yeah. Like people now would look at that and say, yeah, that's a state policy. It's like, obviously it's good feeding hungry children. Yay, that. But there's nothing particularly revolutionary about it. And I would agree. And you know why? Because we saw it begin as a revolutionary action of the Black Panther Party that was part of an overall revolutionary strategic orientation that included feeding hungry children and school, sneakers for children, and political education for adults, and armed self-defense, and all of these multiple tactics that together were part of a revolutionary strategic orientation. And I want to end with this, Suren. The point is not what policy you're doing. The point is, do you have a strategic orientation for transformation and revolution within the application of that policy?
Yeah, I think that out of our work on keeping people in their homes, anti-eviction work, one of the things we arrived at is we do need to have a community land trust. And for me, that is a non-reformist kind of reform, in the sense that it changes the relationship between people and their homes, places they need to survive. There's also another level of transformation that, are we out of time?
No, we're not. But I want to just say the thing about a community land trust, yes, it changes the relationship that people have with their housing. So that's great. It treats housing like a human right. The other thing it does is it literally changes the legal dynamic. It decommodifies the land itself within a capitalist framework. It operates within capitalism, but undermines the logic of capitalism.
Yeah, yeah. For us, it also means that other steps have to follow. Once we form the land trust, we're not building, socialism on one city block. What we're aiming to do, right, is to get the city council to recognize that our collective entity, the city, right, has to become a public developer itself. And so that again leads us down this road of non-reformist reforms. But there's another dimension to the canvassing that I do want to emphasize that's a bit different, right? When I've gone canvassing with the Democratic Party, which I did for the first time in 2020, when we were backing Democratic Socialist for city government, right? And it was really difficult for me to say, hello, my name is Suren and I'm with the Democratic Party. But didn't roll off the tongue. But we went out, we canvassed, and we went back in. We turned in all our data because it was automatically being recorded in our smartphones, etc. Right? When I went canvassing, though, for our local tenant union, right, we begin by talking with everyone who's going canvassing, some people for the first time, about the neighborhood we're going to go into. Right, there's political education happening in that 15 minutes before we go canvassing. More importantly, we're done with canvassing, right? We get back together and we debrief together. We take people's observations and we convert it into knowledge. We help people understand why is it that there were people, lying around outside the dollar store the way they were, right? We got to talk about political economy, converting their observations about what people said to them, the conditions of the home, into something that they could process collectively. And so I think that that's where deep canvassing is very different. It's about transforming the canvasser as much as it is about the issues around which you are canvassing.
That's a very powerful and astute point, Suren, and the idea of literally building community and engaging in political education for the organizer. It's not just we have the answers. It is we've got some experience, we've got some skill, we've got a commitment level, but we're also learning from the process and we're learning from each other, including if we're doing it right, we're literally learning from the people that we're canvassing, right? Like it literally, we inform our process together. And to me, that's the very best of synthesizing grassroots organizing and political education.
Yeah.
So, Suren, folks, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Thanks for extending a little bit longer, Suren. I do want to give you an opportunity for any final thoughts, including how people can keep up with the work that you're doing. So any final thoughts from you, Suren Moodliar?
When you asked me to talk primarily about global tapestry of alternatives and Progressive International, I was immediately excited because, among other things, Progressive International has managed to call our attention to not only big global conflicts, but also to specific battles like freedom for Julian Assange and others. And I think that the thought that I'd like to leave you with is not that these international examples are, the recipe, the answer to what we need. They're not silver bullets, but they are things that we need to engage with at the local level. When I think back at the revolutionary struggles within the United States, I always want to recognize the way in which people like Frederick Douglass made common cause with the struggle in Ireland, the way in which W.E.B. Du Bois sought to use the conference at Versailles, the peace conference in Versailles after World War II, after World War I, to call for the decolonization of the global South. So our history is that we always manage to combine the international and the local, and we won't be able to do it unless we consciously set that as one of our tasks. Cannot be the exclusive task, but it has to be among our tasks.
Again, not either or, but both and. That's the refrain. Folks, I want to thank you, Suren Moodliar, for joining us here on Redneck Gone Green. Most importantly, I want to thank you, the listener, viewer, reader of Redneck Gone Green. And I mean that sincerely. You know, we put out a weekly writing every week on Substack. We've got over 4,000 subscribers and growing. That's a free writing. I'm going to encourage you to please subscribe. Doesn't cost you a dime. But I will ask you if you're able to join for even as little as $5 a month, because we are growing this movement and we are going to be offering an opportunity to join the green room at the end of our program every month if you're able to make a financial contribution. But wait, there's more, because many of you are watching right now on Rumble and or YouTube and or on Facebook. So we literally live stream not one, not two, but 3 different programs at the same time, 3 different platforms. And we record this and make the video available for viewing afterwards. But wait, there's more. We also record the audio. Maybe you're listening to my voice now on a podcast on Spotify or any of the other kind of places where you can get those. So the reality is we give you something to read, something to watch, and something to listen to. And if you find this valuable, I'm going to ask you at the very least, like, comment, subscribe, and keep growing this movement. Please join me next Tuesday, because remember, we go live every Tuesday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. Our guest next week will be with the Foundation for Intentional Communities. We'll be joined by Daniel Greenberg. In the meantime, keep on keeping on. Peace.